Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. This is B.K. Gohare, Deputy Director, Nehru Center, and we welcome you all at the Nehru Center today. It's a very precious day for us. Among us, we are having Dr. Swapan Majumdar, Dr. Swapan Das Gupta. I'm extremely sorry for this. Dr. Swapan Das Gupta, Member of Parliament, Rajya Sabha, and Dr. Makrand Paranjape, a prominent writer. Today, that I would like to tell you this program, once we heard about Dr. Swapan Das Gupta ji, the Nehru Center was very delighted and honor him, feeling honor. Including Dr. Paranjape, as we know, is a prominent writer. And this Munch today, this Nehru Center, uh, as one of its activities in the area of academic infrastructure, is organizing this event as a special case. I would like to welcome the member of organization Friends of India Society International, Fiji, who has taken the responsibility in association with us, organize this event and making this evening possible. I really would like to welcome Shri Amish Tripathi ji, Director, Nehru Center, who has joined recently, and distinguished guest. Amish Tripathi ji within 1 month has tried to upgrade the area of cultural personalities in this prangan. In fact, among all of us, and as you know, he is by profession a writer, written 7 important books, which is a message to the young generation, awakening the light in the heart of young generation of India, not even India, rest of the world, in fact. And these books are very popularly known by the masses. He is, known by the Facebook, etc. 20 million, 2 million people are follower of Mr. Tripathi, in fact, are here, and we are honored to have him as director. I really feel under his direction, the Nehru Center is going to, achieve some of its goals. So now I may like to, just pass on my this mic, the master of ceremony today, Mr. Sushil Rapatwar Saab. He is the core member of the Forum of Friends of India Society International. I may like to request Mr. Rapatwar to come and formally welcome Dr. Swapan Das Gupta, Mr. Paranjape, and Amish Tripathi ji. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guharaji. Good evening, everyone. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome all of you to this, on this chilly, miserable, dark, cold evening that you have bravely battled through and came over here. I indeed promise you that this Herculean effort of yours will not go waste. We have lined up illustrious line of personalities today evening. And on behalf of Friends of India Society International, in short, FISI, we welcome all of you to this evening. We have got 3 very interesting courses to be served. Starters, main course, and desserts. I know we all are very keen to jump onto the desserts, main course, but the starters are mandatory starters, which is there are no planned fire drills. So if in case there is any fire alarm, it's a real fire. So please follow our volunteers and they will safely take you to the assembly point. Unless you have got some amazing ringtone that you want us to listen, I would request all of you to switch off your phones or keep them on silent so that we can hear the personalities today without any disturbance. So, without further ado, as Guhareji mentioned, we will do a felicitation, traditional Indian felicitation in terms of shawl. But I think it's very important for us to know as to why we do what we do, especially next generation. So whenever we ask them to do anything, they ask you, why you want me to do it? Whereas we never used to do that. We used to follow what our parents used to tell us. So this shawl ceremony did a bit of research. So basically, in Hindu Dharma, an individual engrossed in selfless service towards society, it's a mark of respect. So wrapping a shawl around the shoulders of a saint basically amounts to giving a definite form to that infinite. So we are, and then we request them to manifest on this planet and guide us. So keeping that thought in view, can I request uh, the dignitaries to come on stage? Swapan Das ji, Professor Paranjape, on the stage, please, and Amish ji. And I also request Bharat ji, Sunil ji, and Manu ji to come on stage, please. And Anil Nene ji as well. Bharat ji, if you can. Sunil ji to Makrand Paranjape ji. Anil ji to the director, Shri Amish Tripathi ji. And Manu Khajuria ji to Deputy Director Gohari ji. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, as Goharaji mentioned, by we I mean the Londoners, are really privileged to have amongst us, not only for this evening, but for next 3 years, the celebrity columnist and author, banker and a diplomat. His first trilogy, that is 3 books, called Shiva Trilogy, became the fastest selling book in the Indian publishing history. And the Ramchandra series was the second fastest selling book series in the Indian publishing history. He also launched his first non fictional book, The Immortal India. So these 7 books sold, ladies and gentlemen, since 2010, 5 million copies. So we don't really understand the figures unless you put it in a context. But if you split it in there, consistently for last 9 years, every day, his copies sold 1,500 books every day. So even our favorite BBC called his writing as gripping and unputdownable. Ladies and gentlemen, have a big round of applause to our new director of the Nehru Center, Shri Amish Tripathi ji. In your able guidance, sir, and leadership, we hope that FISI and Nehru Center can go a long way towards serving our Mother India. Amish ji.
Um, I promise not to take too much time because this event is not about me. Like all of you, even I want to hear the fantastic gentleman sitting up on stage. I'm going to go off stage very quickly, carrying my chair with me. Um, Swapan Da, I hope you don't mind me calling you Swapan Da on stage. I refer to him as Dada. And Makrand ji are, they are, they're not just fine intellectuals. I kind of consider them my elders. I discuss many thoughts and ideas with them. They are exceptionally well read, and they have the ability to assimilate complex information and bring it out in easily understandable narratives, which many of us can understand. I'm going to make a quick, introduction to the two of them. Not that they need it, but I'm going to run through that in any case because that's what's supposed to be done in the order of proceedings. And I'll give my few initial thoughts on what the discussion should be. Then I'm going to leave it to Swapanda and Makrandji to make their own interventions. So, Swapan Dasgupta ji is a member of parliament and a columnist for major Indian newspapers. He's a PhD in history from the School of Oriental and African Studies, London, and a former research fellow of Nuffield College, Oxford. A journalist for 30 years, he occupied senior editorial positions in Times of India, Indian Express, and India Today. He writes regular columns for Times of India, Telegraph, and Pioneer, and is a commentator on TV networks. He is a member of the Executive Council of Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, a director of the India Foundation, and a visiting professor of Jawaharlal Nehru University, whenever teaching happens there. In 2015, this is not being recorded in the media, right? In, uh, in 2015, he was awarded the Padma Bhushan by the President of India and nominated to the Rajya Sabha. In Parliament, he is a member of the Standing Committee on External Affairs. His earlier books include Nirad C. Chaudhary, The First 100 Years. Makrand R. Paranjape ji is currently Director, Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. His wife, Gayatri ji, is also here. Can we please have a round of applause for her? She is the wind beneath his wings. He was educated at St. Stephen's College, Delhi, and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he earned a master's and a PhD in English. He has been professor of English at the Jawaharlal Nehru University for 20 years, a critic, a poet, and a novelist. He is the author of some 25 books and editor of another 24 books. In addition to hundreds of academic papers and popular articles, sometime I have to learn from him how he is so productive. His latest books include Swami Vivekananda, Hinduism, and India's Road to Modernity, forthcoming, Debating the Post-Condition in India, and The Death and Afterlife of Mahatma Gandhi. Makrand ji is currently a columnist in Open, Mail Today, and The Print. The subject that we have today is Awakening Bharat Mata. I'm going to leave it to the Diggajas on stage to speak more of it, but I want to communicate this to you that in some ways, many of us who come from rooted Indian backgrounds tend to see the journey that is happening over the last few decades as just an awakening. Whereas perhaps the correct way to see it is it's more reawakening. For much of human history, we were economically, scientifically, philosophically among the greatest lands on earth. Angus Mason, a British economist, economic historian right from this land, had done research on GDP movements for lands across the last 2,000 years. And for 15 of the last 20 centuries, India was the number one country in the world in terms of GDP. For 2 of the balance 5 centuries, we were the number 2 country in the world. We've had only 3 bad centuries. That can happen to anyone, even to Virat Kohli. And we are just about getting our mojo back. It's a process of change. In any process of change, as our ancestors used to tell us, is a bit like the manthan. And the manthan, of course, brings out, I'm sure to this audience, I don't have to explain what the Sagar manthan is. But the manthan brings out the amrut at the end of it, which all of us want. But at the beginning, what came out? The wish, right? The halahal. It's almost like it's a natural process of change. Any process of change will have some positives have some negatives as well. We have two fine gentlemen out here who will advise us how we can accentuate the positives and how we can control the negatives. I leave the floor to them. First Swapanda and then Makrandji. And then we're going to have, I hope, a very engaging question answer session. There are cordless mics which will be taken around at that time. But first, Swapanda and Makrandji. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Amish. And thank you very much for the Friends of India for organizing it. I must confess it's the first time I've been called a saint while presenting that. It's quite flattering. I hope I can at least live up to some of those expectations. Amish, in his introduction, spoke at length about the positives and the negatives which come out of any churning, especially a robust churning as we've been seeing in India for the past many years. I won't necessarily say it's only for the past 5 or 6 years. I would say it's a longer process, that sort of churning. Its electoral manifestations may have been recent, but the churning itself is older than that. Let me get to the point about why I brought out this book. It's called Awakening Bharat Mata, The Political Beliefs of the Indian Right. The term Indian right was not chosen by me, it was chosen by my publishers because they felt that it was a convenient shorthand with which you could appeal to the readers. Nevertheless, I think this book was important in some respects. At least I felt it was important to write this book and particularly bring out an anthology of writings on the subject for various reasons. Firstly, for a very long time, the ideas and beliefs associated with contemporary Indian nationalism have traditionally been decried and intellectually rubbished. Just like the Conservative Party at one time used to be called the Stupid Party, I think here we have the combination of the Stupid Party and the Nasty Party sometimes being brought in to the idea, to the belief that this is what Indian nationalism at this point means. The second reason why I felt it was necessary to bring out this compilation was a stray comment which was made by another fellow Stephanian. And I think I think there's a sort of misconception that all Stephanians think one way, and that's on the left. That's not the case. But anyway, this is a very good friend of mine, Ramchandra Guha. He's a very good friend of mine, and I mean, we grew up together. We had lovely times together. So I will never disown a friend because our voting preferences are different. So Ram pointed out, and he said that there are no right-wing Indian intellectuals. And this is a theme which has been taken up subsequently by various people in India to say that there is no intellectual pedigree as far as this body of thought is concerned. So it was important, as far as I was concerned, to actually demonstrate that this is a slightly spurious, if not facile, view of how Indian intellectual thought has developed. And I think Makrand can elaborate at length on how the entire body of thought, which goes by different names, can actually be brought and added to the richness of Indian political and social existence. Now, a lot of people might, at least the more well-heeled cosmopolitans in India, might certainly be slightly taken aback as to why I have taken this picture, which is essentially of calendar art. It is calendar art. Bharat Mata as depicted, you could say it's a very kitschy one. It's not the Bharat Mata, for instance, the more refined Bharat Mata, which was drawn by Abanindranath Tagore. Abanindranath Tagore. And this was the one which is in the popular depiction. Variations of this you will find, sometimes worshipped in live form, sometimes put up as calendars, sometimes gracing political meetings. So where does this idea of Bharat Mata come in? I think for this, we have to necessarily go back to Bengal, and all good things start with Bengalis. With Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. Now, I mentioned Bharat Mata and Vande Mataram in the same breath because often, again, a lot of people have said, why does Modi ji begin his speeches with Vande Mataram or Bharat Mata ki jai? It could be either or, I mean, one or the other. Or conclude with either Bharat Mata ki jai or Vande Mataram. Why? What's the political pedigree of these ideas? Why did it come about? Now, both are interlinked. Vande Mataram, which in India is called something, we have a national anthem when we have a national song. And the national song, according to the ruling in 1950, enjoys the same status as the national anthem. But in reality, it's obviously, in Parliament, for instance, we begin Parliament, any session of Parliament, with a rendering of the national anthem, which is Jana Gana Mana, another Bengali, and conclude when the session is over, not each day, but at the session, the whole session, with Vande Mataram. Now, Vande Mataram was the iconic war cry of Indian nationalism. And it started off from the early 20th century. And that was what Vande Mataram was what defined the Indian freedom movement in a lot of ways. Sri Aurobindo has written probably the best translation of Vande Mataram. And I mean, a lot of you may have read it. But the idea of bowing to the motherland, of worshipping the motherland, was something which he introduced into the parlance. And for him, and in the third verse, particularly of Vande Mataram, it was quite clear that he visualized Bharat Mata to mean Durga. Tuham Durga Dashupraharani. With your 10 hands, the Durga who slays Mahishashur. So for him, as a Bengali, with Durga as Shakti, as the type of worship he was familiar with, he put that out. Others have taken that as a variation of that. But the iconography of Bharat Mata, to put it into the political imagination, was basically the work of Bankim Chandra and Aurobindo, who popularized it. And the rationale behind why they felt it was there, that India was an object of worship, actually was not, again, stemmed from ideas which had been put there by Vivekananda. It's a bit too much. But variations of this, say for instance, when Shivaji, the idea of Shivaji worship, the deification of Shivaji, was brought into by Lokmanya Tilak in Maharashtra. Prior to that, Shivaji had been there. He had been a folk hero. But to make Shivaji encapsulate the idea of Indian nationhood was really the work of Lokmanya Tilak and bringing it into the political forefront. And these various attempts are important because today there is an attempt to suggest that what took place as the freedom movement of India was basically a long drawn out, well imagined, well conceptualized constitutional process whose culmination was the 1950 Constitution of India. A word which is frequently used in this context is the word called constitutional patriotism. And this term has a fascinating pedigree, because this was a term which was again introduced into the current political lexicon by the Germans after 1945. And it's understandable why there were a lot of Germans actually were fascinated by the term constitutional patriotism. They'd just suffered a grievous military defeat, a country which had been decimated, a country which was rather embarrassed and squeamish about its past. And they wanted to, in some senses, abjure the past and start all over again. And that break, they felt, a year zero, which starts in 1945. And in India, a lot of people, some who call themselves liberals in particular, in recent times, it's not always the case, have taken this and said, constitutional patriotism is what we have. There's another word which is used simultaneously with it called constitutional morality, but I needn't go into that. But it's constitutional patriotism. In other words, Indian nationhood, the starting point of Indian nationhood is 1947/1950. Prior to that, what existed, yes, existed, but it doesn't shape our contemporary nationhood. So the schism in India is very sharp. If you are to talk about fault lines, that is the precise fault line which you see. Those who trace Indian nationhood, who see it as having a far deeper roots in time, and those who see it more or less as beginning from 1950. Maybe this is an oversimplification in some respects, but I think sometimes an oversimplification helps in defining what has taken place. Hence, Bande Mataram, which was really the defining slogan of the Congress movement, right through the early days, when it was fighting for national independence, today is rarely used by them. Rarely. I won't say it's not used, but it's rarely used. The second and third verses are certainly never used, because the imagery that is put forward there is thought to be idolatrous and therefore potentially offensive to some people. And this again brings up to the question of, can nationhood be completely devoid of cultural forms? I mean, can we have a completely sanitized nationhood which only takes into account modern, non-religious forms? And again, this forms another basis in which another fault line starts, where you say, what is the basis on which Indian nation began? It's culture. And culture in India can rarely, if ever, be separated from faith. It's only guided by faith, but to a very substantial extent, faith and localized forms of worship, etc., form an essential part of defining who you are as an Indian. Your identity, your cultural identity as an Indian is seen in that respect. To deny that, you're talking about recreating, just like Stalin wanted to create a socialist man, which was devoid of everything else in the past. Here you're trying to create an Indian who has very little connections with the past. That's why it's important at this stage to sometimes do a bit of historical archaeology and resurrect some of those ideas which shaped that. And among these ideas, which are today one of the most contentious issues, which often is invoked in the Western media in particular, is this entire question of cow slaughter. If anything else, I think I've seen that in the West, the issue of cow slaughter, the antipathy towards cow slaughter, forms a part of the general mirth of India. Sometimes it defines Indian exoticism, but more than often, it's an object of great ridicule. Now, I'm not questioning about people's food habits, etc. That's a different matter altogether. But the most important thing to note here is that this was an important part of India's cultural resistance to colonialism. And you'll find this in Vivekananda, you'll find this sometime in Bankim Chandra, you'll find this in a lot of the earlier writers who wrote about it, that how the issue of beef was very important for them because it defined a certain Indianness. It was not a matter of their own personal food freedom that mattered, but it was how important it was culturally to them. And the mobilization which took place, particularly in the late 19th to about, right up to the 1940s, 50s, had the movement against cow slaughter as one of its main themes. It would interest some people to note that most of the legislation against cow slaughter in India has not been brought about by the BJP. It's almost entirely been brought about by erstwhile Congress governments. And that's an important point to note, because the Congress party, and I'm not getting into what the Congress party should or should not do, it's a very important institution. It's the largest opposition political party, and I believe in taking it very seriously. But the manner in which the Congress party has evolved over the years is also something which has to be taken into account. And that the history of the Congress party would show that throughout the 40s, throughout the 1930s, throughout Gandhi's entire movement, the mobilization against colonial rule and the movement against cow slaughter more or less happened parallelly. And they synergized. Whether this was right, whether this was wrong, is another matter altogether. But this is a facet of history which we should not deny. And therefore, what is happening in India today, the repugnance or whatever it is of cow slaughter, is to some extent a reaction, but it's also a reaction to a form of spurious cosmopolitanism which has been trying to be brought into the whole scene, whereby you disown a certain cultural heritage rather than trying to understand it in some ways. That's the whole point about it, which I think. So the Congress, as it evolved till about the 1950s, actually operated on two levels. At one level, there was the agnosticism, the scientific temper, the rationalism, the socialism of Jawaharlal Nehru. And that's an important facet of India's history. It's important because it imbibed a large measure of the Western socialist tradition which had been there, particularly from the United Kingdom. But against this was another underlayer of the Congress, which was how the Congress mobilized itself in the grassroots. And there, the symbols of mobilization were far more authentic. And I use the word authentic in quite willfully and deliberately. Therefore, when the Congress tried, particularly after the death of Nehru, to make the Nehruvian consensus the defining ideology of the whole body of politics, a certain reaction started seeping in. And in my book, I, for instance, had an interesting extract from Nirad Chaudhuri, who personally had a great deal of admiration for Western values, personally. I mean, he lived the last years of his life in Oxford. And I remember hosting him at this very venue in sometime in the 90s. Niraj Chaudhary pointed out how there was a schism, there was a deep divide, and he was writing in 1967, between what might be called the middle classes, who were far more traditionalist in their orientation, and another body which actually drew its inspiration in the more modernist Indians who started off from sort of Ram Mohan Roy onwards. And the friction, and he said this friction is going to come to a head at some point. And that friction did come to a head. And one of the many ways in which this friction came to the head was on the question of Ayodhya. Now again, here we see another, between two different ways of looking at this whole issue. One was the thing that how can you say that Ram was born on that exact spot? That's the most common thing. What evidence is there? Is there a birth certificate to actually demonstrate he was born there? Why can't you allow a mosque to remain and you build a temple somewhere else? It's part of the entire discourse. Against that, there are two things, which is there is a whole body of local thought, local beliefs, which emanated from Awadh, which said that that was the place where we believe that was the place where Ram was born. But not only that, we believe that there was a temple there which was destroyed and was replaced by a mosque, more as a symbol of power to actually assert the political might. And that became, therefore, in the local context, a symbol of national humiliation. Now, that was not the only symbol of national humiliation. I mean, there are more potent and powerful symbols like that which exist in Varanasi, for instance, where actually the boundary of the mosque and the old temple actually merge. And so it's quite it can be deeply distressing at times. But that's not there. But however, for various reasons, Ayodhya became that symbol. Now, the opposition to Ayodhya, to the temple construction at Ayodhya, was also sought to be based on what might be called negationism, which is to say that the history of medieval India was not as troubled as some people imagine it to be. That actually it was a past which led to what is often called the Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb. Now there is undoubtedly a large measure of truth in that. There is no such thing as a very pure culture. Every culture does blend. Our entire tradition of classical music, as we've seen it, also derives a lot from the patronage of the courts which were there. But the idea to deny that such vandalism actually took place constituted an attempt to show that you people are ignorant, you don't understand history, you are basing it completely on a form of mythology which is not history, and therefore your ignorance does not deserve any place in the popular culture and the public culture of India which is there. It's a different matter that today the Supreme Court has ruled in one way that they are on the side of the ignorant, and but that's what it is. So overall, and I'll be very, very brief, I think I've exceeded, I said I'll speak only for 20 minutes and it's nearing coming to the near 20 minutes. To talk about Indian nationalism as something which emerged in 2014 as a consequence of the electoral mobilization which had been engineered by Narendra Modi is, to my mind, a remarkable display of ignorance. What Narendra Modi actually did was he picked up the strands from a pre-existing culture which hadn't been articulated powerfully in a political way, made good alliances with other large sections of modern India, and therefore used the disquiet which had been steadily creeping in against a form of cultural alienation, which was a consequence of modernity, which was also a consequence of globalization, with various things, and used it to maximum political advantage. In the process, he orphaned a large number of people who had become the custodians of Indian culture as they saw it. It was the process of orphaning those who were the dominant elite at that time, which has led to such a revulsion in certain circles, particularly in the English language, which is why people like Makrand and I, being from St. Stephen's, finds ourselves in a disgraceful minority in that community. But it's a process, and I think it's also an assertion of the people who were left out. It's what a friend of mine often calls the revenge of the small towns. It's why someone like Amish, his books sell by the kilo. It's an enviable situation to be. But the theme, what is most important is look at the themes of his book, where he picks it up from. It's this search for your cultural roots. That is what makes it so significant. And I think those of us who see India purely in terms of whether I'm wearing a nice tie or whether I'm wearing a band gala actually miss the point totally. There can be two worlds which blend, and that authenticity and your ability to engage with the rest of the world can go hand in hand. And this book was a modest attempt on my part to actually show what the intellectual pedigree of that body of thought was, why we like technology, but why we are also very keen on Ayurveda. The so-called conflict which you see is not really a conflict. And in India, as they used to say, and I think this is one of the things the British civil servants of the East India Company got it absolutely right when they tutored people in Haileybury and said, for everything that is true about India, the opposite is equally true. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be here this evening. There's hardly anybody who claims to be an intellectual in India whom I admire more than Shopanda. I think he combines grace with an astonishing, I think, command over facts and, should I say, also a certain tradition of debating and presenting these facts. And I'm really privileged to be here to share the stage with him. Thank you, Shopanda, for this opportunity. Thank you, Amish ji, very much for this. And I think that I'm going to pick up something that Shopanda said. And of course, thank you, Nehru Center. And I also want to thank my host in London, my wife's cousin. I don't know if he's here. Oh, okay, in the back row, Gautam Iyer. Thank you. But I'm going to pick up something that Shopanda said about the two Indias and the fault lines between them, and how for the first time, I think, we have come beyond these fault lines to a situation where these two Indias, on the one hand, of course, they are at war with each other. It's an uncivil war. It's not quite a civil war. But on the other hand, they sit together, they talk to each other, and we are coming to a kind of Hegelian synthesis beyond the fault lines. And this is represented in the work of Amish, who actually has picked up this whole corpus of Indian thought, mythology you may call it, and then given it a modern garb. And he's India's best-selling author. You know, people swear by him. He's mobbed. He's a celebrity, and he's also a very inspiring figure for the young. You know, he encourages people. You know, it's completely opposite of the aloofness of a certain kind of Indian celebrity. You know, who would you know, want to have nothing to do with the unwashed masses, so to speak. This is an opposite kind of inspirational author, and Shopanda, whose book is really a record of history. You know, it's an anthology of writings and documents. So you see, these are two discourses altogether. One makes myths contemporary, and the other, in some ways, shows the power of historical documents to create myths. And what I want to do today is to talk about three things. First of all, I want to talk about Shapanda's book, Awakening Bharat Mata, which is an extraordinary anthology. I recommend it to you. It brings together for the first time authors whom we've completely forgotten, you know. Ramanand Chatterjee, for instance, Girilal Jain, the erstwhile editor of Times of India, Sitaram, you know, Goyalji, you know, who was in a way, he and Ram Swarupji, you know, they fought lone battles to represent a particular kind of position, which in the book is called the right. And a whole host of, you know, Bhandarkar, R.G. Bhandarkar, and Ranade. And he starts, of course, with Bankim. There's Neeraj Chaudhary. And there's a wonderful, wonderful, very eloquent speech by Vajpayee after the Bhivandi riots. So there are these texts which we have completely forgotten about, which are brought together for the first time under the covers of one book. I'm going to talk about the book in a moment, but I want to remind everybody that today is Jawaharlal Nehru's birthday. It's 14th of November. We are at the Nehru Center, and somebody was going to clap. I think we should clap. And if I had a thesis statement for my talk today, I was going to say that the fault lines in modern India can be represented by two extraordinary figures, Jawaharlal Nehru on the one hand and Swami